The range officer looked down at the worn Springfield rifle resting on the bench and laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a loud, mocking laugh that echoed across the shooting range. He turned to the younger shooters gathered around the high-tech equipment and said, "This old man thinks he can hit 1,600 yards with that museum piece. Someone should tell him this isn't the 1940s anymore." The old man in the red jacket said nothing. He just adjusted his grip on the rifle that had travelled with him across an ocean 70 years ago. His weathered hands, steady despite his age, moved with a familiarity that spoke of decades of muscle memory. The other shooters smirked, returning their attention to their computerized scopes and carbon fiber stocks. But what none of them knew was that those same hands had once held a perimeter in the frozen hills of Korea when failure meant death for everyone in his unit. His name was Thomas Brennan, though nobody at the range that morning had bothered to ask. They saw only what stood before them. A 70-year-old man with white hair and a white beard, wearing a faded red jacket over a plain shirt, his expression perpetually sad and serious. His boots were scuffed, his jeans worn at the knees. He had driven 3 hours to this competition in a truck that rattled and wheezed, arriving just before registration closed. The entry fee had taken most of what he had budgeted for groceries that week, but when he heard about the Extreme Long Range Challenge, something in him stirred. Something that had been quiet for too long. The competition drew shooters from 6 states, men with expensive rifles that cost more than Thomas's truck, scopes with ballistic computers that calculated wind drift and Coriolis effect automatically. They wore tactical gear covered in sponsor patches and spoke in technical jargon about BC coefficients and mil-dot holdovers. Thomas had none of that. He had his Springfield M1903A4, the same model he had carried in Korea, meticulously maintained over the decades. The wood stock showed its age, darkened by years of oil and handling. The scope was original military issue, its optics simple by modern standards. But the rifle was zeroed, the action smooth, and Thomas knew every idiosyncrasy of the weapon like he knew the lines on his own face. The range officer, a man named Derek who couldn't have been older than 35, processed Thomas's entry with barely concealed contempt. "Sir, are you sure you want to enter the extreme distance category? The targets are at 1,600 yards. Most people use that rifle for historical displays, not actual competition." Thomas met his eyes with that sad, serious expression and said quietly, "I'm sure." Derek shrugged and took his money, muttering something about liability waivers and false hopes. A younger shooter standing nearby, decked out in the latest tactical apparel, leaned over to his friend and said loud enough for Thomas to hear, 1,600 yards with iron sights and a bolt action. I'll buy dinner for everyone here if he even hits the berm." Laughter rippled through the group. Thomas said nothing. He simply picked up his rifle case and walked to his assigned shooting position. The morning sun climbed higher as the competition began. Shooters at the shorter distances fired first, the crack of rifles punctuating the desert air. Thomas sat on a folding chair behind his shooting bench, eyes closed, breathing slowly. He wasn't sleeping. He was remembering. Remembering a ridge in Korea where the temperature dropped to 30 below zero, where Chinese forces outnumbered his unit 15-1, where he'd held a position for 14 hours with that same rifle model. Remembering shots taken at distances the training manual said were impossible, shots that had to be made because lives depended on it. Remembering the weight of responsibility, the clarity that came when everything else fell away and only the target, the wind and the rifle existed. When they called the 1,600-yard shooters to the line, Thomas stood slowly, his joints protesting. He carried his rifle to the bench, moving with deliberate care. The other competitors were already set up, prone behind their weapons, eyes pressed to scopes that cost thousands of dollars. Thomas remained standing. He opened the worn leather case that held his ammunition, rounds he had loaded himself, measuring each powder charge with precision learned over decades. The brass casings were polished, the bullets seated with exact consistency. He loaded 5 rounds into the rifle's internal magazine, the metallic click of each round sliding home a sound he had heard 10,000 times. Derek, the range officer, stood behind the firing line with a spotting scope. He keyed his radio and announced the conditions. Wind from the southwest at 8 miles per hour, temperature 72 degrees, humidity low. The sophisticated shooters made minute adjustments to their computerized systems. Thomas simply looked downrange, studying the mirage, watching how the heat waves danced above the desert floor. He noted the way the flag at the 1,000-yard marker moved, how the vegetation at different distances bent in the breeze. His mind performed calculations that no computer could replicate, calculations born from experience that couldn't be programmed or downloaded. The command came, "Shooters, you may commence fire when ready." The modern rifles began to bark, their reports sharp and precise. Spotters called out hits and misses. Miss, left 2 mils. Hit, outer ring. Miss, high. Thomas chambered his first round, the bolt sliding forward with a smooth, oiled precision. He settled into his shooting position, not prone like the others, but standing with the rifle supported on a rest, the way he had learned to shoot before most of these competitors were born. Through his scope, the target at 1,600 yards appeared as a small dark shape wavering in the heat. He took a breath, released half of it, and pressed the trigger. The Springfield roared, its recoil substantial compared to the muzzle-braked modern rifles. Thomas worked the bolt smoothly, ejecting the spent casing, chambering the next round. He didn't look away from the scope. Downrange, through Derek's spotting scope, a white marker appeared on the target, dead center. Derek blinked, adjusted his scope, looked again. He keyed his radio, his voice uncertain. Shooter position 7, that's a hit. Center mass. The chatter along the firing line died down. Heads turned. The young shooter who had offered to buy dinner stopped mid-sentence. Thomas fired his second round. Another hit. This one just inches from the first. Then the third. Another center hit. The fourth round struck slightly left, but still well within the scoring zone. The fifth round hit center again. Derek stood up from his spotting scope, his face pale. He walked over to Thomas's position, staring at the old man as if seeing him for the first time. "Sir, I need to verify your target. That's 5 for 5 at 1,600 yards. Thomas simply nodded, his expression unchanged, that same sad, serious look. He began to clean his rifle, running a patch through the barrel with practiced efficiency. The other shooters had stopped firing, all attention now focused on position 7. One of them, a man with a rifle that cost $8,000, had only managed 2 hits out of 5. The best score before Thomas had been 3 out of 5. Nobody had shot a perfect string. Derek returned 15 minutes later, accompanied by the match director, a retired Marine colonel named Patterson. Patterson was a big man with silver hair and a bearing that spoke of decades in uniform. He held a tablet displaying the verified target images. "Thomas Brennan?" he asked, his voice carrying authority. Thomas stood, meeting the colonel's eyes. "Yes, sir." Patterson studied him for a long moment, his gaze moving from Thomas's face to the worn Springfield, then back again. "That's some shooting, Mr. Brennan. Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Thomas hesitated, then said quietly, "Korea, 7th Infantry Division. I was a designated marksman." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Patterson's entire demeanor changed, his back straightened further, and something shifted in his eyes. "Korea," he repeated slowly. "What years?" Thomas replied, 50 through 53, Chosin Reservoir, Heartbreak Ridge, Porkchop Hill. Patterson's hand moved unconsciously toward a salute before he caught himself. Around them, the other shooters had fallen silent, the mockery and dismissiveness evaporating like morning dew under the desert sun. Patterson turned to Derek, his voice sharp. "Get this man's complete score verified. I want photos of every target, and I want his name added to the Ranger's Hall of Honor board." Derek stammered, "Sir, he still has to shoot the second string. The rules require 2 strings of fire for the extreme distance category." Patterson nodded. "Then let's give Mr. Brennan the range he deserves." He turned back to Thomas. "Sir, would you be willing to shoot another string, for the record?" Thomas looked at the Springfield in his hands, then back at Patterson. "Yes, sir, that would be fine." Patterson called out to the gathered shooters and spectators, his voice carrying across the range. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to witness something rare. This man is Thomas Brennan, a combat veteran who held the line when it mattered most. He's going to shoot another string at 1,600 yards with a rifle most of you probably think belongs in a museum. I suggest you pay attention. You might learn something." The second string began 20 minutes later. By now, word had spread throughout the range complex. Shooters from other categories, range staff, even people from the parking lot had gathered behind the firing line. The atmosphere had transformed completely. Where there had been mockery, now there was hushed respect. Thomas loaded 5 more rounds, his movements unhurried, methodical. He settled into position again, the Springfield an extension of his body. The first shot broke clean. Center hit. The second followed. Another center hit. The third, fourth, and fifth rounds found their marks with mechanical precision. 10 shots, 10 hits, all at a distance that most modern shooters considered extremely challenging even with every technological advantage. When Thomas cleared his rifle and stepped back from the line, the gathered crowd erupted in applause. Patterson stepped forward and extended his hand. Thomas shook it, his grip still firm despite his age. Patterson said, "Mr. Brennan, on behalf of everyone here, I apologize for the disrespect you received this morning. You've reminded us all that skill, experience, and dedication matter more than equipment. Your performance today will be remembered at this range for years to come." Thomas nodded slowly, his sad, serious expression softening just slightly. "I appreciate that, Colonel, but I didn't come here for recognition. I came because someone said it couldn't be done, and I've never been good at accepting that." Derek approached, his earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by genuine shame. "Sir, I owe you an apology. I judged you before you ever fired a shot. That was wrong." Thomas looked at the young range officer for a long moment, then said, "You're not the first, and you won't be the last. People see what they expect to see. But here's what I learned a long time ago. Respect isn't demanded. It's earned. And it's earned through action, not words. You remember that, and you'll do fine." Derek nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, sir, I will." The young shooter who had offered to buy dinner if Thomas hit the berm approached nervously. "Mr. Brennan, I owe you and everyone here dinner, but more than that, I owe you an apology. Would you allow me to buy you lunch today? I'd like to hear about your service if you're willing to talk about it." Thomas considered this, then nodded. "Lunch sounds good, and I'll tell you what I can. Some memories are easier to share than others." The young man's relief was visible. "Thank you, sir. That means more than you know." Patterson arranged for professional photographs of Thomas with his Springfield, documenting the historic shoot. He also pulled Thomas aside and said, "I'm going to make some calls. There are people who need to hear about this, people in the shooting community who will want to honor what you've accomplished. Is that all right with you?" Thomas shrugged slightly. "If you think it matters, Colonel. But I'm just an old man who knows his rifle." Patterson smiled, a genuine expression of respect and admiration. "You're much more than that, sir. You're a reminder of what we should all aspire to be." As the day wound down and Thomas packed his Springfield carefully back into its case, several younger shooters approached him with questions about technique, about reading wind, about the mental discipline required for extreme long-range shooting. He answered each question patiently, sharing knowledge accumulated over 7 decades. He showed them how to read mirage, how to feel the rifle's natural point of aim, how to control breathing and trigger press without the aid of computers and sensors. They listened with an attention and respect that had been completely absent that morning. Before Thomas left the range, Patterson presented him with a custom plaque commemorating his perfect score at 1,600 yards. The plaque included a photo of Thomas with his Springfield and an engraved inscription, "Thomas Brennan, 7th Infantry Division, Korea. Perfect score, 1,600 yards, Springfield M 1903A4. Proof that skill and dedication transcend technology." Thomas accepted it with quiet dignity, his eyes glistening slightly. "Thank you, Colonel. This means more than you might realize." Driving home in his rattling truck, the plaque resting on the passenger seat beside him, Thomas thought about the day. He thought about the young men and women he had met, so confident in their equipment, but often lacking in fundamental skills. He thought about the disrespect that had stung more than he wanted to admit, and the vindication that had followed. But mostly he thought about the rifle resting in its case behind his seat. The same type of weapon that had served him faithfully when his life and the lives of his brothers in arms had depended on it. That rifle represented something these young shooters were only beginning to understand. That true capability comes not from having the best equipment, but from mastering whatever tools you possess through dedication, practice, and respect for the craft. The story of the old veteran in the red jacket who shot a perfect score at 1,600 yards with a World War II Springfield spread through the shooting community like wildfire. Videos were posted, articles written, forums buzzed with discussion. Thomas received calls from magazines wanting interviews, from manufacturers wanting to sponsor him, from veterans' organizations wanting him to speak. He declined most of them. He had never sought fame or recognition. He had simply wanted to prove, one more time, that the old ways still worked, that experience and skill still mattered, that a man should never be judged by his appearance or his age. But he did accept one invitation, to teach a class at that same range on fundamentals of marksmanship. Patterson organised it, and 30 shooters attended, ranging from teenagers to men in their 50s. Thomas stood before them with his Springfield and taught them what he knew, not just about shooting, but about discipline, patience, and respect. He taught them that technology is a tool, not a substitute for skill, that the fundamentals never change, regardless of equipment, that true mastery comes from understanding your weapon so completely that it becomes an extension of yourself. At the end of the class, as the sun set over the desert range, Thomas fired one more demonstration shot at 1,600 yards. The rifle spoke. The bullet flew true, and the target marker appeared exactly where he had called it. The students erupted in applause, but Thomas simply smiled that sad, serious smile and said, "That's not magic. That's not luck. That's just an old man who never stopped practicing, never stopped learning, and never forgot that respect for the craft is what separates a shooter from a marksman."